Good evening and welcome to Colorado Decides, a joint production of Colorado Public Television and CBS4. I'm your host, Dominic Dezzutti. Joining me as always is political analyst Eric Sonderman. Our series continues tonight as we look at the race for state treasurer of Colorado. Joining us for the next 30 minutes are the Democratic challenger, Betsy Markey, and the Republican incumbent, Walker Stapleton. Everyone, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it. We know our time is limited. So, Eric, why don't you start us off?
Yes, welcome indeed. I just learned that this is the first time the two of you have actually met, which is a rarity, so welcome. Let me start with sort of a jump ball question for both of you. We'll start with the incumbent, Walker. When my wife and I go to invest our money or our assets, we don't really care if it's a Republican investment advisor or a Democratic investment advisor. We just want a return on our assets. Why is this office even a partisan office, and is there a Republican approach to investing states' resources versus a Democratic approach? Why is it set up like it is? We'll start with you, Walker.
Well, I think that's an excellent question, Eric. I don't think it should be a partisan office, and that's why I'm proud to say during my first term as treasurer, every single bill that has come out of the treasurer's office, of the many bills that we have passed, every single bill that has originated out of my office has been co-sponsored by Republicans and Democrats in the legislature. We've either had a Republican sponsor in the House or a Democrat sponsor in the Senate. And I'm very proud about that because I think that should be the approach that somebody should take. It should be common sense fiscal policy legislation that the treasurer should work on at the Capitol. Furthermore, if you look at how Colorado invests its money, we invest in fixed income bonds. That's very different than a lot of other states. A lot of other states take what I would say are not necessary risks with public money. They invest in equities, some even invest in hedge funds, and in Colorado that has benefited us, and ultimately it's benefited the taxpayer of Colorado because during economic downturns it has mitigated the losses considerably. So in 2008, for instance, when the stock market imploded, Colorado did not suffer a lot of those losses as a result of the housing bubble. So we have a very conservative investment policy in Colorado, and I believe that investment policy should be in place whether the treasurer is Republican or Democrat, because at the end of the day, safeguarding taxpayer money is #1 priority for the treasurer of Colorado.
Betsy.
Well, that's right. It does not need to be a partisan office at all, because what is most important is that we're making sure that we are safeguarding the public's money now and into the future. But also, I think it's important that a state treasurer be engaged every single day to work on behalf of the taxpayer, and that includes working closely with the governor, with both parties in the state legislature, with elected officials across the state, and with the private sector to make sure that we're continuing to move Colorado forward. That's not a Republican or a Democratic notion, but it is one that has to do with the work ethic that you bring to the office.
Both of you mentioned both transparency and accountability on your campaign websites. With factors that aren't controlled by the legislature or by Colorado law, how is transparency reflected in the treasurer's office? What can you do about it that isn't already dictated by law? Betsy, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think there's a number of things. People should be able to know, the taxpayers, exactly where and how their money is being spent, and that should be all on the website. And as I have looked through the website, I haven't seen a lot of changes that have been made over the years from the previous state treasurer, because transparency is critical. Over the last several years, State Treasurer's Office has not issued any STAR reports, state transparency and accountability reports. They have been issued by previous state treasurers, and I think it's an important tool to let people know, again, how and where their tax dollars are being spent, and that's important for all offices, but particularly when you're talking about taxpayer money.
Walker?
Well, that's an excellent question, and we have tackled transparency in the treasurer's office with gusto. First of all, to quickly address Betsy's points, the STAR report is no longer published by the treasurer's office. It's published by the state auditor's office, and so that does not come under the purview of my office. It is published, the STAR report, by the state auditor's office. Furthermore, if you look at, we had a pie chart, which I would refer to largely as a gimmick, because nobody visits the treasurer's website. In fact, literally you can count on one hand the number of people that visit it. But what have we done proactively for transparency? A heck of a lot. We passed sweeping debt consolidation in Colorado. We transformed the way Colorado issues its debt and streamlined the process under the treasurer's office for the first time in Colorado history amongst 18 separate state agencies. We had a Democratic-sponsored Gail Schwartz in the Senate. We had a Republican sponsor in the House, Representative Sonnenberg, Jerry Sonnenberg. And what we did was, before this bill, all 18 separate state agencies, if you can believe it, had operated autonomously of one another. And so if the legislature gave authority to the Department of Transportation, for instance, to issue highway bonds, there was no further oversight that anybody within the Department of Transportation had any financial experience whatsoever to be conducting a public finance transaction where Colorado's credit was being put at risk. The process for hiring bankers and lawyers wasn't a blind one. So if you had a brother that worked for Wells Fargo or a sister that was a bond attorney, you could put them on the transaction. There was no refinancing requirement. We have transactions, if you look across our debt portfolio, that nobody's bothered to refinance, which was costing Colorado and the taxpayers a lot of money because there was no incentive to refinance. We created the first refinancing mechanism ever. We created the first tracking system. Colorado couldn't even track how much debt it issued amongst 18 separate state agencies. We changed all that. Now when we issue debt, it's all under the Treasurer's Office. This has increased the transparency and accountability of Colorado with the rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and Moody's, the three main rating agencies that I deal with every day. And I'm extremely proud of this bill because it was in an election year that we passed it, a Republican and Democratic sponsor. It passed unanimously through our legislature in a presidential election year, and the governor signed it.
Can I just add on to that? You know, just because you don't think people look at the website is not an excuse for not updating it. I mean, there are parts in there where the treasurer is referred to as a she. That was a previous treasurer where Kerry Kennedy's name is still listed. And in terms of, there was something that a previous treasurer started called GovTracks, where someone could go in and, you know, list what their income is and find out where that money, it's an estimate, where that money is being spent. And that hasn't been updated in 2011. And I think that's an important tool. And let me just finish on the STAR report. I know that's not issued any longer by the Treasurer's Office, but I'll tell you what, as state treasurer, I'm going to push the state auditor and say, oh, well, I'm sorry, it's not my job anymore, but it is your job. Being a leader is making sure that these kinds of transparency reports are issued. Whether it's not your direct responsibility, it needs to happen.
I would just respond that this pie chart is embarrassingly simplistic. I wouldn't even bring it into my son's sixth grade or 6-year-old first grade class at school and try and explain Colorado's budget. Colorado's budget can't be explained in one pie chart. One of the follow-ups of this bill that if I'm in office or if Betsy is in office, I hope she'll work on with the same amount of vigor, is that we are working on the first comprehensive financial statement for the state of Colorado in Colorado history. So just like you're reading a financial report from Microsoft or Apple Computer, we're going to be publishing this every 6 months. So you can look at Colorado's debt transactions, the structure of them, when they were agreed to, when they're going to be terminated, the length of the bonds, the maturity of the bonds. And this is real actionable intelligence rather than simply a splash page on a website.
Let's move on.
We've both established that you don't think necessarily it needs to be a partisan office, but clearly it is, and maybe the website needs to be updated a little more regularly. We'll leave that one alone. Let's look into the next 4 years. How does the state treasurer's office differ if it is Treasurer Markey versus Treasurer Stapleton as the head of that office? What is the fundamental difference between the approach the two of you would take to that office? We'll start with you, Betsy.
Okay. Well, this may seem very basic, but I think the first difference is that I'm going to show up to work. I'm going to work full-time. This is not going to be a part-time job for me. I'm not going to have another job. I'm not going to take another salary. I mean, I think Colorado deserves someone who is going to be taking this job seriously. That, I mean, when you get paid by the taxpayer to do a full day's work, you should be there full-time. You know, and I've been a business owner. I've had 2 successful businesses, and quite frankly, if I had an employee that was getting paid full-time and not showing up for work full-time, I'd fire him.
I think there's been an allegation made.
Absolutely.
You want to respond?
I am delighted to respond to this allegation because I've never had a chance before, and it's completely baseless. When I became treasurer, I was CEO of a publicly traded real estate company. We were in the process of taking that company private. Companies go private and public every day in America. We took the company private, and for a period of 3 months, I was a consultant to the company. The reason being that I know the business backwards, sideways, diagonally, in every which direction, and the process of taking a company private is an onerous one, to say the least. After that, I became an owner of the business. I have derived income from the business as an owner of the business. And the last time I checked, there's public officials of both stripes, Republican and Democrat, who derive outside income from investment income and ownership of businesses. So I have not been a consultant. I have not drawn a salary for more than 3.5 years. So any suggestion otherwise is absolutely false, categorically false, and not the case whatsoever. What would I do, though, as treasurer in the next couple of years? I would make sure that Colorado has designed programs and can afford to pay its bills. Betsy and I have a big difference on the pension system. She thinks that I'm somehow obsessed with it. I think it's a serious problem. It's a $26 billion liability to Colorado taxpayers. That equates to close to $35,000 per taxpayer, according to Forbes magazine. She thinks that the pension problem is nothing to worry about in Colorado. She also wrote, quite famously in a Denver Post op-ed, that the president's health care mandate, Obamacare, which she was ready to support, was going to be the largest cost-saving initiative that Congress would ever undertake in its history. The General Accounting Office, which is a nonpartisan office in Washington, estimates that that'll cost $6 trillion, or there's been estimates as high as $14 trillion. So clearly we have a different point of view when it comes to underlying economic reality.
Markey, you stepped into where I was going to go, and Betsy, you may have already gone there. Let's talk about para. That is one of the issues that is in the news quite a bit throughout Walker Stapleton's, Treasurer Stapleton's tenure so far. Does para need to be reformed? What is the situation? You heard what Walker's saying. Right. What's your point?
Sure. Well, I know that Walker campaigned on para and said that it was the most important job of the state treasurer was to sit on that para board. And since you've been in office since 2011, I think there's been 30 meetings, and you fully attended 5 of them. And I don't think that's being invested as wanting to reform para. You got to show up to meetings. And your first order of business was to ask that your deputy be able to sit in your place. This is an important, it's an important retirement program for 500,000 people in Colorado.
I agree 100%.
And in 2010, there was bipartisan legislation which did a number of things. You know, when the recession of 2010, pension programs around the country were in trouble, and Colorado was one of the very few states in the country that really made some substantive changes to reform para. They did a number of things. They reduced the cost of living adjustments. They raised the retirement age, increased the amount of contributions for both employers and employees, put it on a much more sustainable path. Just this past year, the board voted to lower the expected rate of sustainable path. Just this past year, the board voted to lower the expected rate of return from 8% to 7.5%. Those were all necessary changes, again, to put para on a much more sustainable path. And I do think that we need to make sure that we are letting these changes take place. I mean, I do not advocate, like Walker does, in dismantling the program and turning it into
That's baloney. I've never said that I advocate dismantling the program.
Well, you would like to change it into a 401k
That's not true. That's not true either. And let me address the attendance. The attendance, that's another completely baseless accusation. First of all, the policy of a deputy treasurer attending a board meeting has been in place for 30 years before I've even been treasurer. It's the only position on the para board of which there's 15 members where the deputy and the treasurer vote as one. The reason is because the treasurer's schedule is quite busy, and sometimes the treasurer misses meetings. However, you should check your records, Betsy, because if you look at the attendance record between the deputy treasurer and myself, just like Eric Rothaus acted in the capacity for Kerry Kennedy, your pal, we have a perfect attendance record. In fact, if you look at para's audit, which I had them do, it's a near perfect attendance record. This is a baseless political charge that's a diversion from the real issues. Most people who've been following pension reform in Colorado know that I have been the most effective treasurer in Colorado history in pension reform. In fact, John Hickenlooper, at a meeting of the Colorado Association of Commerce and Industry 2 years ago, said, and I quote, "Walker Stapleton is a leading voice for reform for the pension system in Colorado, and people should listen to what he has to say." So I think that's a pretty good endorsement from somebody from a different party. But we do have a difference of opinion, and let me address this. This is important. We changed the rate of return from 8 to 7.5. This is something I had been advocating for 3.5 years. When Senate Bill 1 passed in 2010, the contribution rates for the system were based on 8%. Now that the assumed rate of return has been lowered to 7.5%, the liability for para, the bill for para, has gone up by more than $3 billion. It's an economic fact. And at some point, PARA is going to have to go back to the legislature and find another $3 billion somewhere to make it solvent. This is not a partisan point of view. This is an economic fact. This is a math problem that is growing in Colorado, and we need to roll up our sleeves and address it in a bipartisan way. Colorado's taxpayers demand it, and also our schools and our cities demand it as well, because if we don't, they will go bankrupt because of unsustainable pension obligations.
Good follow-up.
I want to drill down on this one further. And let me start with you on this one, Betsy. My recollection is that the board of PARA this last year, when they changed expected rate of return from 8 to 7.5%, that was a very divided vote. It was 8 to 7, and the treasurer chimed in on the majority side of that vote. If you had been treasurer, you would have had the potential to flip it to where that rate of return was not changed. How would you have voted in that situation?
I think that the rate of return change was a reasonable one to make. You see other states around the country have done the same thing, have followed suit and lowered their expected rate of return to be on the conservative side. And I would have done the same thing. But to get to your point about PARA as well, it does need to be done in a bipartisan way. And as you have, if you want to make reforms and changes to PARA, I'd like to see you come up with a specific solution instead of suing the PARA board on which you sit for records of the top 20% of the beneficiaries, which is, quite frankly, privacy information, and uses it as a political football instead of coming up with a specific change you would like to make, and then you bring it to the state legislature, as was done with Senate Bill number 1, and it was supported by both Democrats and Republicans. And that's how you make changes, instead of basically saying, which you have said, it's time for people under PARA to suffer. Well, I don't want 500,000 people.
I've never said it's time for people to suffer. I've said that the only way to fix the problem is shared sacrifice.
I'm not making this up, and I'm not making up your attendance
You're
record.
making up everything. You're making up everything because it's a diversion from the substantive knowledge which you lack of the issues. You have no substantive knowledge, and so you're making all these political attacks as a diversion. But Eric, let me address.
That's quite an accusation.
Okay, you'll have a chance. Let Walker go here.
First of all, the rate of return at 7.5%, I believe, is still too high. If you look at states that have fully funded pension plans or healthy pension plans, according to Morningstar, it's an 80% level, which is nonpartisan, or the Pew Center for Research on the State or the Milken Institute. Most of those states, Florida, Indiana, Texas, they've had rates of return around 6%, and we're still at 7.5%. So there's still a ways to go. The pension system is 58% funded in Colorado, compared to an 80% healthy funding level for pension systems by nonpartisan groups. We have a ways to go to fund the pension system properly in Colorado. And what was the next? Oh, my lawsuit. I would be happy to discuss my lawsuit, which Betsy terms as political football, but the governor of the state, the Attorney General of the state, and the Treasurer of the state, the Governor of the state, John Hickenlooper, joined my lawsuit against the Supreme Court for basic financial transparency. This is what Betsy is referring to as political football, a lawsuit that was joined by the Democratic Governor of the state, which kind of takes away from the whole idea that somehow I'm on some sort of partisan crusade, when the Governor of the state stepped up, and I give John great credit for doing that, and he did it because it was the right thing. It wasn't about violating anybody's privacy. In fact, we asked for information by zip codes. We didn't ask for anybody's name. We asked for information to make sure, critical financial information, to make sure that PARA could pay its bills going forward in the future. And by the way, any business that has a $26 billion liability shouldn't be given the benefit of the doubt when it comes to transparency of information for board members. So if Betsy wasn't for transparency, I think that's revealing, and she and I differ on that, and she differs with the governor of her state as well.
I promised you one more shot at this, Betsy.
Yes, yes. Well, first of all, the Supreme Court in Colorado dismissed the suit, and they let the Court of Appeals ruling stay. And
that's right.
You know,
I can't control the courts, but it doesn't mean the suit wasn't right.
And it was taxpayer dollar that funded that, and it didn't go anywhere. And again, when we have an issue with a program, then you need to come up with recommended changes as opposed to highlight people who are you know, this is a retirement again.
I'd be happy to sit down with you and share my changes.
People, in the state of Colorado.
Sure.
But getting back to criticizing me for not having any substantive knowledge. That's quite an accusation. I mean, I have been in business for 35 years. Both in the public and the private sector. I've owned and operated 2 small businesses successfully, and this is an opportunity again to really do this work, partnering with people around the state to continue to move Colorado forward, and that's been my experience. I will do this full time and not have another job. Now you have denied that, but it's on your financial disclosure report as of January of 2014. So you can maybe that was wrong, but then you need to get it updated.
Betsy, on the financial disclosure report, you're supposed to list all sources of income, and I still derive income as an owner of the business. As I told you, I derive income from a number of businesses because I was in business before I was in politics. That shouldn't preclude me from serving. It has nothing to do with the fact of the accusations that you've lobbied at me that I'm taking another salary. That's just absolutely bogus.
It'll be only a few minutes before we get to closing statements. What we've talked about PARA, and there's a lot of different issues within Colorado politics. You're going to have to involve the state treasurer and the legislature. You're going to be called upon, whoever's tenure is up next is going to be working with the legislature on that next issue. Beyond PARA, what is that next big issue that the state treasurer should be working on with the state legislature to fix, adapt? What does it need to be? Betsy, we'll start with you.
Okay. I see as a major issue, well, two are I think education, but also transportation infrastructure. Our infrastructure needs are great in the state, and we just don't have the money to support all of that, all the improvements that we need to make. I look at other states. There's a couple of treasurers in the Northwest who have gotten together to create an infrastructure exchange where they're looking at how do we creatively, since we haven't had a highway bill in a number of years from Congress, how do we look at funding, maybe through private to public partnerships, our many infrastructure needs in the state. And I see that as a critical issue moving forward for the state of Colorado.
Walker?
I think the 2 critical issues for, actually there's so many of them. I'd say that there's probably 3 that are critical. Number 1 is finding out whether the expansion of Medicaid in Colorado can be covered by the hospital provider fee. And to the extent that it can't, we're going to have to figure out how to fund Medicaid expansion in Colorado. That is going to be a critical budget issue for Colorado going forward. Furthermore, how we fund the retirement system properly, that's a critical issue as well. How we fund K through 12 education. We have created a Gordian knot of budget mandates in Colorado, and we have to get more flexibility in our budgeting. And the last thing I'd say is how we deal with our energy issues in Colorado. The energy industry is a huge component of our economic success in Colorado. I think the governor has recognized this by putting a commission together, and how we deal with that proactively.
Good evening and welcome to Colorado Decides, a joint production of Colorado Public Television and CBS 4.